5 shots. John Lennon staggers into the lobby area of the Dakota Apartments on Manhattan's Upper West Side. He cries out, "I'm shot. I've been shot." And he collapses from his fatal gun wounds on the 8th of December, 1980. A few years later, Albert Goldman was approached to write Lennon's biography. Goldman had previously written biographies on Lenny Bruce, the comedian, and Elvis Presley. They were both controversial and highly critical biographies, and Albert Goldman was essentially asked to do the same with John Lennon. The result was The Lives of John Lennon by Albert Goldman. And this is a $1 million hit piece. Albert Goldman's intention, you could charitably say, was an attempt at a corrective to the lionization of John Lennon that had begun to grow following his murder, a corrective to the Lennon the Saint, Lennon the true talent of the Beatles narrative that had grown. That said, you can only really look at the Lives of John Lennon as an attempt to defile the temple, to kick over Lennon's statue. So, the opening chapter makes for grim reading. It's set in 1979, and we see John Lennon secluded away in a dark room watching TV all day while Yoko Ono conducts business and runs his affairs, and maybe has affairs, while Lennon is creatively constipated, we could say. He only emerges from his dark room to bark orders at the help and at baby Sean Ono Lennon. And he would often come out completely stark naked in front of the staff and go about his business. But otherwise, he was a lost soul. And what follows are many dark revelations about John Lennon and his life with Yoko Ono. It suggests that Yoko Ono's miscarriage in 1968 was as a result of John Lennon beating her. That the Lennons were so hooked on drugs that Sean was born addicted and had to be weaned off smack as a baby. And there are accusations of Lennon soliciting rent boys in Bangkok, and it remarks on Lennon's bisexuality, his anorexia in the Dakota days. Funnily enough, Paul McCartney comes out of it quite well. It's almost the inverse of Philip Norman's Shout. But except Goldman only uses praise in order to contrast negatively with Lennon's failings. We all know John Lennon could be guilty of hypocrisy from time to time. He had weaknesses. He was someone who was in search of something he could never find, in search of someone who would, quote, slip him the answer, in search of a strong woman who would be a surrogate mother of sorts. all of much he copped to in his interviews, in his songs. He was, as much as he self-mythologized during the 1970s, he was very confessional. He was very open and painfully honest at times. And Goldman really pounces on that fact. And no smoke without fire, you might say. Indeed, for a lie to have any traction, it must have an element of truth. Although Goldman has an axe to grind, clearly. And speaking of which, in the chapter Paul Grinds Pepper, which is about the making of the album Sgt. Pepper, Goldman suggests that the only reason that the Beatles stayed put recording in Abbey Road instead of jetting off to LA to work in the state-of-the-art recording studios, as the Rolling Stones did, was because they were beholden to EMI, that the bosses were putting their foot down and not allowing them to go. And they were somehow weak-willed enough to go along with this. Does that ring true to you? By 1967, I don't think the Beatles were answerable to anyone. I think the reason they didn't go to the US is pretty clear. They not long come back from a grueling and controversial tour of the US in the wake of the Bigger Than Jesus controversy, as well as a misadventure in the Philippines with Imelda Marcos. Both brutal tours that I would say put them off traveling for quite a while. And in fact, they made the unprecedented move of not touring, cutting down on their public appearances, and disappearing into the studio. The Beatles were happy to stay at home. The Beatles were, by 1967, turning inward somewhat, whereas bands like the Rolling Stones were turning outward. The Stones and Led Zeppelin were ushering in this new era of stadium rock, these mega tours, playing in stadiums, playing in festivals, whereas the Beatles, stung by their horrific experiences on tour, were concentrating on studio work. They were isolating themselves away. EMI would be more than happy for them to be out on the road with these mega dollar tours. But the Beatles clearly were not happy. Beatles were more than happy to withdraw from the limelight and to stay in the studio, crafting new music and experimenting with the form. That's where their heads were at. But Goldman suggests that they were the good boys of rock, more than willing to jump through hoops. They were obedient puppies. As for the music, Goldman does cover the Beatles' music and John Lennon's music, of course. Some people quite like his reviews. I'm not so sure. I will say this for Goldman. He does have a unique perspective, and whatever is in this book is all Goldman. Um, it's not a cut and paste job, as so many even acclaimed biographies are. Um, everything in here is from scratch. It's clearly not a quick cash grab. It is a weighty tome. It is dense with poison. Thousands of people were interviewed for this book, many of them in Lennon's outer circle and from his past, many of whom had rarely, if ever, had been interviewed before, which gives us a unique perspective. However, there were no primary sources interviewed. Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Ringo, George Martin, they declined to be interviewed for this book on the strength of the Elvis biography. They knew what was coming. They knew what Goldman was about on the strength of what he said about Elvis, which, if you don't know, Goldman's Elvis biography labeled him as a hillbilly, racist schmuck who got lucky, essentially. Again, a lot of the negative things that he claimed about Elvis in his book have since become wider knowledge. But again, it was a hit piece. And so McCartney and the rest declined. I know that Thelma Pickles was John Lennon's art college girlfriend before Cynthia. Telephoned Mike McCartney, who was pondering whether to accept the invitation to be interviewed for the book. And she told Mike McGeer, that the experience of being interviewed felt her leaving as if she had been mentally raped, in her words. So Mike McCartney didn't fancy that, so he said no. So, but this cannot be disregarded. 5 years of research, I think, thousands of people interviewed. The only trouble, of course, is that Goldman takes the least charitable take possible on absolutely everything. He uses it as a weapon to smash the Lennon myth that was forming. So what of this Goldman guy comes across as a smug, pretentious, quite conflicted. His obsession with sleaze and sex seems to be a projection. Albert Goldman wasn't a Beatles fan, wasn't a Lennon fan or an Elvis fan. He liked the pre-rock and roll era music, he liked swing music, and he seems to look upon Lennon's generation with disdain. Hence his attempt to discredit the entire culture, not just Lennon, not just Elvis, but the 60s counterculture and everything that came after is fair game for him. Goldman was a racist. You only have to read his sections on Yoko Ono to realise that. She's described as simian looking and all the rest of it. He's hung up on sex. He's pseudo highbrow, filled with self loathing. However, Uh, this is a great read. It's an interesting read. I would say it's more interesting than, say, biographies by Ray Coleman, which are quite bland. There's some weird ideas. Um, Strangely obsessed with this notion that uh, many, if not all, of Lennon's compositions were based on three blind mice. He's a weird guy. And Goldman was paid $1 million for this book. I think he denies it was a million. Yeah, I think he said it's more like $850,000 a mere amount, although through syndication and reprints in newspapers, I think he must have easily clocked up a million for this. As with Goldman's Elvis book, bottom line, this is titillation. It ultimately fails in telling us what made Lennon great. Even so, this, in the end, you would have to say this is an exercise in muckraking by Albert Goldman. John Lennon paid with his life for people's attitudes towards him, and Goldman repays that with writing this. On the back, it has some bull quotes. Paul McCartney calls it trash. Cilla Black calls it rubbish. Julie Burchill, on the other hand, says, read this book as soon as possible, but beware. Contact with the truth can be fatal to your blind faith. Julie Burchill was an enemy writer in the punk era. She was hired to be a iconoclast, and she was an entertaining writer for a time, but she's gone completely loony. But it makes sense that someone from the punk generation would gloatingly look upon this destruction of the 60s temple with glee. So what else do we have? This was released in 1988. This is my copy from 1989, I believe. Yes. It was released a year after the 20th anniversary of Sgt. Pepper, and in the lead up to the 10th anniversary of John Lennon's murder. So there was a lot of Beatles hype and John Lennon hype around at the time. And this was the big book. And funny story, this was the first Beatles related book I ever read. It's quite a beginning, but despite the nature of the material, I ended up becoming a big John Lennon fan. I was newly into the Beatles, and Lennon was the one as a teenager that I gravitated towards. So, despite everything, this is the one that launched me on my journey. Just goes to show. It does hold some importance, but ultimately, this book is shabby exploitation. However, it is a must-read. Speaking of must-reads, if you don't like that dirt, muckraking filth, read something much more wholesome. Oh, look at this. It's Some Other Guy by D.C. Merriweather. Oh, how embarrassing, that's me. This is my new book. It's a Beatles book. It follows Stuart Sutcliffe and the fledgling Beatles as they travel to Hamburg. And it's out now in paperback and ebook, a fictionalized take from 1960. And it's a very good book. Please buy it. It's available from Amazon.com. I think that is all I have to say. I'll see you around the clubs.